Hello again. There's a few things to cover in this video, and this has been a development in the wealth tech case that I want to go through, and just want to put it in a wider context. And in previous videos, I discussed private assets, and I want to invite you to look at something that I posted in the description, link in the description, which will put some of that into context as well, albeit from a different author. But I'll come to that. So the first thing I'm going to look at is the announcement from the FCA that they'd fined Barclays over issues of client identification and so on and so forth. And it's quite interesting the way they did that, because they bundled it in with two cases. The first case, the larger case, I personally have pretty much no knowledge of, so I won't comment. But they bundled wealth tech into that as well. I think that's very interesting how they've done that, because and I'll come on to why I believe they've done that. But we'll look at the wealth tech bit first. Our favourite Therese Chambers was out, and again, I'm not picking on her. She just fronts these things up. So therefore, we don't really have a lot of choice. As I'll come on to, I think she's symptomatic of a wider degradation in society, which I'll also cover. If you remember in the book Lost the Races, I made the very same point the FCA have made, where I said that in this client account that Barclays had opened for wealth tech, that this was contrary to the in the case of wealth tech, a lack of permissions they had in terms of client money permissions that weren't granted, which we're told that documents were subsequently falsified. It's very embarrassing for a sophisticated financial system to have to confront that reality. It's more of a frontier market type calamity that you would see. Not a world-class financial services market, as we're told we have. That in essence, John was able to allegedly dupe Barclays into operating a client money account, and when he didn't have the required permissions. And I made the point in Lost the Races that really all Barclays needed to have done is to go onto the FCA register and check what permissions the business had, and they would have noticed this glaring inconsistency, and that would have brought the situation to a halt, one would have thought. I think that was back in 2021, and the FCA have fined Barclays for that lack of due diligence, you might say, and Barclays had also agreed to make a contribution to the losses that wealth tech clients have suffered as a result of this unfortunate situation. So that the fine looks very low, I would say, for one thing, and I do wonder whether that's linked to Rachel Reeves's backslapping speech with banks and wanting them to rev up lending and so on and so forth. So that bit actually looks quite low. The contribution is, I guess you'd say, better than nothing. Anything that comes back to clients who have suffered losses is a good thing. Again, I would have expected it to be a little bit higher than that. But let's have a look at the comments. And I'm going to quote from Chambers' comments here, and I've posted them into the description if you want to see them. The consequences of poor financial crime controls are very real. They allow criminals to launder the proceeds of their crimes, and they allow fraudsters to defraud consumers. Now, I wouldn't disagree with that. Clearly, we don't want people using the proceeds of their crime in the economy, even though you don't have to walk very far to see it these days. And also, as I made the point in Lost the Races, money laundering is a technical term with a political interpretation. We only have to look at the Russian situation where, it wasn't long ago where, football clubs, people dealing in real estate, private schools, the stock market, and so on, were falling over themselves to get a slice of Russian money. We always knew where that money came from. Nothing really changed that much. And when people were challenging the legitimacy and the source of this money, there were plenty of London lawyers who were writing threatening letters and threatening to take action against them if they published it. So there is a huge amount of duplicity in the way that we look at money laundering. But the going on, the extraordinary bit of her quote, it goes, banks need to take responsibility and act promptly, particularly when obvious risks are brought to their attention. Again, you wouldn't disagree with that, but we've got a regulator, and particularly a person who fronts these things, Chambers, and I know she's got a partner in this operation with I think it's Steve Smart, but I wouldn't disagree with the comment, obviously, but if you look at videos 2 and 3 and the narrative I posted in the description of the warnings I gave the FCA, here we have a regulator and a senior person within that regulator taking action against a bank for something they themselves failed at doing. And in that really, and again, look at videos 2 and 3, you'll see the warnings I gave, and there were a couple. There were 2 options they had. One was do a full audit of, as I recommended, of the cash flows between the regulated entity, John's regulated entity, and his LLPs. And if they didn't want to do that initially, which has subsequently been done by BDO, they just had to go up to Newcastle and say, your website says that Verton's running these assets under management. Where are they? And it would have been found out then. So they've done what they're accusing Barclays of doing. And that has really always been the issue for me, because it isn't the fact that I didn't want to, well, I certainly wouldn't relish it, because there's nothing pleasant about this case at all, nothing to savour in any respect, a lot to be extremely sad about. But I would have gone along with this legal proceeding, but I needed some contrition from them, the FCA, that they'd failed. There's been a whole host of catastrophic failings right the way across their range of activities on this case. And I needed an acknowledgement of that. And I needed them to apologise and to work with Treasury to come up with a better solution, immediate solution to help the hardship that people were facing. And they refused, blank. And then I was in a position where I wouldn't allow myself to be put in a legal process, whereas as much of it being a case against John Dance and WealthTech, based on the allegations made against him, it would, in my mind, be a whitewashing exercise for the FCA as well. And I wouldn't accept the duality of that process. And despite, if you look at the video, A Disorderly Response with Duncan Alger's response, where he tried to really sort of threaten me in a few sort of covert ways, that's something I've experienced from the FCA right through when I pushed back. I have cooperated up to the point of intelligence. And, he tried to, standard procedure where if you don't really go along with them, they threaten you with, you haven't cooperated, they threaten you with prejudice, it's standard, because it's blackmail, essentially, witness intimidation, whatever you want to call it. Whereas it's embarrassing if I had to defend that one, and, we're stopped to the rafters. A whole host of other things about the FCA, the howitzers are primed and ready to fire at any time of their own choosing. But in this particular case, there's, when I wrote the book Lost the Races, people have contacted me, and where they had relevant information, I felt they have been directed to the FCA. Now, I can tell you with teenage style intellect, developed intellect. That's a generalization, of course, because there are some exceptionally bright teenagers that are much brighter than adults. But generally, year 9 sort of level, you would have expected a level of sophistication where the FCA would have already contacted the people that have been directed to them. And I know they've contacted them as a result of the book Lost to the Races. And that was in addition to so much more I gave them. And again, that was not to create trouble. You are obliged to do it, whatever you think of the FCA, and that was done. What I wouldn't do is go along with the legal duality of a legal process, which is based on whitewashing and alongside a case against John Dance. Now, let's have a look at some of these issues, in particular this issue, because the first thing you'd say is, Therese Chambers, clearly an educated woman, you look at her career as being successful, and you would say, why write something like that? Because if you look at that comment, the duplicity of that comment, a person would think, well, that isn't the right thing to do. And if you were a victim of this scandal and you read these comments that I'm making here, I would think, I wonder how that's going to make them feel. And it probably isn't going to make them feel very good. And that would trouble many people, because you think, I don't want to add anxiety to people that have already suffered an awful lot. But then you look at it and think, this isn't just Chambers. This is symptomatic of society, and we see it everywhere. I mean, if you look, for instance, at Keir Starmer, I think you would need a huge list to accommodate the number of times that man stands up and makes misleading, manipulative statements. And it's not just me who says that. And I don't think it's just him. There are politicians that do this all the time, but he's done an awful lot of it in just over 12 months when he's been Prime Minister. He's still peddling this £22 billion black hole, which we all know is a subterfuge, because they knew, if they were honest with the electorate prior to the election, that they wanted to put up taxes, raise borrowing, and so on and so forth, that they wouldn't have won anything like the number of seats that they did. They possibly still have won because of the inefficiencies and the lack of the democratic principles of the first past the post system, but they wouldn't have won anything like as many seats. So in many ways, this £22 billion, it's never been independently verified. And really, what is it in the context of a state that has trillions of pounds of debt? It was a subterfuge to come in and do something he wasn't honest enough to say to people he wanted to do prior. So they created this. And he repeats and repeats and repeats that and knows very well it's not true. Now, if we then look at Rachel Reeves, she has embellished her CV. That's no conspiracy there. And there are issues with the integrity of the content of a book she wrote, and there are other administrative issues that have occurred throughout her career, which I won't go into, but you'll be familiar and you would have read about them, I'm sure. And I was undertaking a skills cast course earlier this week, actually, and it was looking at things like integrity and so on and so forth. And one of the practice questions was somebody who had sort of done something quite similar and greased up their career achievements. And straight away it was flagged up as an issue. Now, in the past, if somebody was accused or found as embellishing their CV and then having to correct it on multiple aspects, that would be an instant step down. You wouldn't continue. But like Chambers, like Starmer, And also you could add Jonathan Reynolds, his trainee solicitor embarrassment. When he was studying to be a solicitor, he never made it, but he would have been drilled into him, just as it is to investment professionals and advisors and such, that you cannot purport to be something you're not. It's a big professional faux pas. He would have known that, but he still did on multiple occasions. They were not slips of the tongue. And the reality is these people don't care. They know that they've misled. They know that they've manipulated, and they don't care. They look at us with arrogance and say, what are you going to do about it? And they just continue and continue and continue. So Chambers really is just symptomatic of a rotten system. And strangely enough, this got us talking recently about the study, and I'm talking generally here. I'm not assigning what I'm going to say to specific individuals. I'm just talking generally. There's a book, and I'll show you. It's called Without Conscience, and it's written by Robert Hare, who's the sort of, I guess, father of this modern study of psychopaths. And he developed something called the psychopathy checklist. And there is a misconception with psychopaths, mainly due to the media and films and so on, and certain novels that have been made into films, that they're all about these horrendous killers and so on and so forth, and carving knives when people are washing the dishes and so on. And yes, there is an element of that, but we were discussing it in terms of white collar psychopaths, in terms of, if you look at the characteristics: no conscience, no remorse, superficial charm, compulsive lies, lack of conscience, and there's a whole load of things. And you start looking at it and you think, could we say that we are led by people who would score quite highly on, the psychopathy checklist has been, subsequently modified, but from when Robert Hare initially devised it, are we led by people, not just in the UK, globally, who would score very highly on in this checklist? Could we even say, I know this is like a metaphor now, but entities have psychopathic tendencies? You could say NATO, the FCA, other agencies, and so on, in terms of their ability to mislead and do it with complete impunity and show a complete lack of remorse. It's one to think about, but I think it has some validity. And when you look at the news, look at YouTube, whatever, however you get your information, and you've got somebody making a statement to you or being interviewed, look at them, probe what they say, be the Socratics. Don't buy the sophist nonsense. Probe it. Look at the inconsistencies, look at the people, look at the sincerity of them, and ask yourself, what is this person? Are they sincere? And I think you'll start to see things a bit differently. Now, this leads me on to back to Reeves, and leads me on to another case, another instance I brought up in the book, where Lost the Races, where I said, I use the term, the victims of the scandal will ultimately be sacrificed on the altar of the secondary objective. Now, if you go back and listen to Rachel Reeves' speech in Mansion House, the so-called Leeds reforms. Leeds reforms really are the Edinburgh reforms promoted by Jeremy Hunt with a bit more attached to them. Rachel Reeves doesn't do new ideas. She takes ideas and she tweaks them, a bit like Gordon Brown's golden rule is her now cast iron fiscal rules, although Gordon Brown was intelligent enough to put enough subjectivity into it. He wasn't boxed in like Reeves is and in a real mess. That's another story. So Reeves doesn't do new ideas, so she's taken Edinburgh reforms, called them Leeds reforms, and added a little bit to them. And it's hard to listen to all of Reeves because she's not an easy person. I don't want to get into the world of insulting too much at all, because that's not what I'm trying to do. But it's hard to listen to all of her speech. But if you can do it, at least take out the main extracts of it, and you'll see exactly what I meant. Yeah. And I go back to what I mentioned in the previous video when I had the questionnaire sent through from the Transparency Task Force, and they were sort of saying if you've been involved or associated with certain scandals, and it was answering questions like that, and they said, Rat is expected to step down at the end of his term, and what would your message be? New CEO coming in, and I wrote on it, and they would tell you this, that this won't happen. I knew it wasn't going to happen, and because they need to put on a continuity show, they need to pretend, they need desperately to suppress wealth tech, which is why this piece of news was bundled in with another piece of news. They've got to suppress wealth tech. You can see the dialogue between Treasury and the FCA spanning two governments, and you can see the synchronized narrative because they know wealth tech, the breadth of the failures are huge. It would embarrass a frontier market, and the FCA have to go down this route of trying to sling mud at everybody else and make themselves look like they're the heroes, even though they are responsible for a huge number of failures themselves. And that just wouldn't sit well with an initiative, be it Edinburgh reforms, now Leeds reforms, where the financial services sector, which is an important sector to the UK economy, is being spearheaded to drive growth. So it has to be suppressed. And you'll see more of these type arrangements come through, particularly after the legal process runs its course. There's certainly one provision you can see at an organisation that's sitting there, and it's, to me, looks like it relates to wealth tech, or certainly the early Vertum days, they'll want to do these deals where they can put something on the website that we've issued this fine and this organisation has made this contribution. Maybe they haven't remitted liability, maybe they have. And do it in a very sort of opaque way where it looks like they're leading it and claiming justice for the victims, which some case they are. And my position on this has always been that so catastrophic are the FCA's failings on this that all clients should get their money back. And I don't subscribe to the theory that, this is a white collar crime, so those the very richest people that have been caught up in this, the most affluent, those with the biggest portfolios, should just wear the losses, because I don't believe that should happen. And I don't believe it because I don't believe they did anything wrong. They didn't take reckless levels of risk. They were badly let down by the regulator. They didn't do anything wrong. And the fact that they're wealthier doesn't, in my mind, justify them facing any losses. It's the same as when I do my job. There are small portfolios and there are medium sized and there are very large portfolios. It ultimately doesn't really matter because each client, I don't claim to be anything exceptional, I'm not, but each client has a right to expect I will do my best. I will try my best and do the best I can for them. And I always do. And I always will. But, you can't say that because a certain person is this or that, they deserve a different outcome than another person when, they should benefit from the same process. And the larger clients that have been caught up with this, I believe, have been badly let down too, and they should be fully refunded. And the risks of recovering the cost of that should rest with the FCA and ultimately the Treasury. If the Treasury doesn't like it, which they won't, given the indebtedness of the UK, as Reeves has come in and the debt's been accumulating for many governments. Can't blame it on her, but she's clearly made some calamitous errors that have put the financial markets on a nervous footing when it comes to UK debt. So they wouldn't like wearing the costs of a £80 million shortfall. But they should go and talk to their regulator and say, how did this happen? We're not allowed to do that because of prejudice. And that leads you back to the Reeves speech. She has to work on the basis that the system isn't broken and that the FCA are an effective regulator. In fact, all she's doing effectively is saying that they should deregulate and so on and so forth. Incidentally, this narrative would never run if people knew the full extent of the failings of WealthTech, because people would say, hang on, if we don't want to deregulate, we need reform in a more constructive way in terms of making sure this doesn't happen again. But that just wouldn't sit with the ambitions for growth. Incidentally, and the sad part of this is as she's sort of encouraging risk-taking, deregulation, and so on and so forth, and actually putting the FCA in a difficult position in a different way in what they're trying to do, it will end in disaster. Because one, the regulatory system and the conflicts of interest within it, which I've highlighted through the series of videos, needs attending to urgently. And the other is, if you think about it, we're encouraging people to take more risk, be it banks, consumers, where we're saying that they shouldn't hold all this cash, they should put it into the stock market and so on and so forth, and that will drive growth. But we're doing it at a time when equity markets are at all-time highs. Credit spreads are super thin. The level of indebtedness in the financial system is extraordinary levels. There's clearly going to be a sovereign debt issue at some point or another. Whether the venue of that's in the UK, because it isn't just them. Look at indebtedness in China, it's off the Richter scale. France. There are a number of countries that are living vastly beyond their means and sitting on enormous amounts of debt. So there's clearly going to be a sovereign debt crisis at some point. I can't tell you exactly when, but it will happen. And we're encouraging people to take more risk, to lend more money, to issue more mortgages and things like that at a time when there are clear danger signs there, and it will end in a catastrophic way. And people will lose a lot of money and suffer a huge anxiety in the process. And you start to see how rotten in some ways the system is, because they know there are issues with the regulator, but they're so desperate for growth. But ironically, some of this deregulation may work a little bit in the short term because you can get some sizzle out of it, but it will lead to a disaster, as history has shown later down the line. But ironically, even that aside, if you look at how dumb this government is, they are doing things, whether it's be infrastructure spending and raising house building and so on, if we ever see any of this, but I'm sure we will eventually, that you can look at and say, yeah, that will generate growth. But at the same time, they're putting up taxes, they're raising regulation, they're cycling with the brakes on. It is just economic illiteracy. And if you look at it, you have Rachel Reeves, Darren Jones and Emma Reynolds effectively overseeing the economy, and that can't end well. And this is indeed the crisis of these managed democracies that we live in. They are throwing up horrendous options, and at some point you will see a lurch to extremes, because the outcomes of the ineptness of these people will be so bad, it will lead to enormous unrest. You can see it coming. And, and that is what I meant in terms of people being sacrificed in the altar of the secondary objective, which is using financial services essentially to raise the growth and competitiveness of the economy. In itself, not a bad ambition, but they're doing it all the wrong way. And in the book, I said they put the cart before the horse. Essentially, that's exactly what it is. You need to reform your regulator. You need to build from up, from the ground upwards, and they're just doing it in a botched style, and it's going to end extraordinarily badly and encouraging risk taking at the top of probably the top of a risk cycle is horrendous. And what they've done is they know the sheer scale of the embarrassment of the wealth tech situation, and they know how it would undermine this ambition, and they look at it and say, well, we've got an £80 million shortfall, which is a staggering sum of money to a lot of people, but in the grander scheme of things, the size of the financial services sector and what they believe that can do to generate growth, it's tiny. So you effectively say, well, they'll just have to wear the injustice of it. And in this inverted morality that we operate, and this hierarchy of greed, protect the regulator, remuneration of legal professionals, and right at the bottom, what's left, throw at the clients. You will, that's the way it has to be, because their needs are small in comparison to the overall ambitions. Now, back to the issues of private assets. I won't dwell on this huge amount, but you notice I've put a link in the description, and if you follow it, it'll take you through to an article, and it's written by Craig Murray, who I don't know personally, but we have some commonality. We've worked in Uzbekistan in the past, although albeit at different times, and that's he's written an article that links to the Palestinian Action Group, who are now been described as a terrorist organization relating to this incident of throwing I think they threw red paint at planes that the RAF were using. And now, for reference, I don't condone defacing property. Personally, I don't think that's the right thing to do. But they were trying to raise awareness of how how Britain and the RAF have been playing a support role in the genocide that's been taking place in Palestine, which is undoubtedly, and I covered this in the book, and I said this would be an issue, that this is effectively the worst genocide this side of the Second World War, with notable exceptions. Parliament is complicit too. Credit to those who have tried to speak out. That's why I keep using the term with notable exceptions. But Parliament in its aggregate is complicit. In this instance, what Murray's done is he's traced the ownership. I'm relying on his research here. It's not my research, but I'm interested in it because of the issues I raised with private assets. He's traced the ownership of these planes that the RAF were using, and he's traced them back. Beware of the interchangeability of terms like hedge funds and private equity. They're often used in an interchangeable way, but because there is in some ways a bit of a crossover between the two. He's traced them to a private equity stroke hedge fund organization. Read the article and he'll show you how he's done it. And that in the essence is private assets, because you'll notice also in Reeves's speech, he again starts talking about private assets and this Pisces. Private assets is like, in many ways, like the terrorism legislation, terrorism bills, because you front it in a reassuring way, and that's been done in private assets, supporting startups and fast growing, exciting British businesses, which is undoubtedly a good thing. But when you start to dabble in behind it, you'll see some very dark arts in terms of the other stuff it's supporting as well. And it's the same with the terrorism bill. Again, fronted, we want to protect you. We want to thwart would-be terrorists. We want to bring to justice terrorists. That's all good, of course. I would never argue with that. But you widen the definition of what is a terrorist to potentially including anybody who dares to question the government. And in terms of the Palestinian Action Group here, I don't think throwing red paint over planes is the right way, but I would take some convincing that makes them terrorists. But you see, because they're raising a very, very difficult issue here, a very inconvenient issue of complicity in genocide, make them terrorists. Shut it down. Anyone who supports them goes to prison. That's the way the system rolls. And if you look at the organization that Murray identifies as being the ultimate owner of these planes, they are FCA authorized, regulated. So is it any wonder that we find ourselves asking why the FCA behave the way they do and our politicians behave the way they do? Because that is the system. There is no morality in the system. There is no conscience in the system. That is not to say that everybody who works in financial services is bad. They're not. But the way it's led, the very top, the hierarchy of it, I would suggest is. And that extends to politics as well, wherever there's money. And again, a lot of what I've written in the book, Lost to Races, has come to pass. I identified Ukraine, and I said that I don't justify the Russian invasion, because it is an invasion, nor the annexation of Crimea, because fundamentally when these things happen, innocent people bear the costs of it. But I understand the provocations of it. There are no good and bad states, and that is why I made those points. And in Ukraine, I said there is no plan. All this nonsense, victory for Ukraine, there is no plan. There never was a plan. Just throw money at it and, effectively use Ukrainian lives to try to embarrass Putin and try to foment some regime change. And you can see. I mean, if you go to Poland, you will see lots of fighting age Ukrainians who are just giving up. They don't see a point to it, despite them claiming to be patriotic. But those who have stayed behind in Ukraine to fight are exceptionally brave. But let's be honest, if Ukraine didn't stand on such a strategically important point on the Eurasian landmass, wasn't rich in natural resources, the West wouldn't care less about freedom and democracy, and we know it. And anything that suggests otherwise is nonsense. And that's the way the system rolls. So is it any wonder we see this nonsense from the FCA, we see this nonsense from Starmer, we see this nonsense from Reeves, and we also saw it from their predecessors, and we'll also see it from the people who come in behind them until the whole system changes. So I hope that puts some of this into context for you, and I'm sure we'll see plenty of more shenanigans along the way. Speak to you soon. Bye.